So this last stage of the day, we're going to first have Barbara come back up and give us, potential look into the future. What happens when we take what's known about different bark beetles and incorporate their relationship between development and growth and development with climate, and given the projections and expectations for warming climate in Colorado and the West, and then finish up after Barbara with Ben, who will talk about a project ongoing at Western Water Assessment with other collaborators to try to disentangle these different things that are going on at the same time and that affect hydrologic processes in our forests, including climate change, dust on snow, and bark beetles. But first, Barbara.
So I wanted to just sort of move on from where we left off before, but just kind of linking with some of the stuff that's been talked about today. In my opinion, and maybe others in the room, I think these bark beetles are very similar to fire, like we've been talking about, in that you have to have the right conditions, you have to have a trigger, you need to have the right climate conditions for it to go. Perhaps maybe they are a little bit more harder to control once it gets going. But I wonder if we spent even a partial amount of the millions of dollars that are spent on fighting fire really targeting, if we can predict where and really monitoring and knowing when things are just getting started and really just hitting it hard with millions of dollars like we've done with fire, maybe we could control. I don't know, that's just a thought. So we talked, does this just like take a minute?
The first slide.
Is it something other than the arrow?
I'm going to try this one
first,
and then the other buttons should work. Yeah.
Okay. So as we talked about this morning, there's a potential that one of the triggers for these outbreaks could be drought, and there has been some correlation between the droughts that occurred in Colorado, well, across much of the West in 2000, with potentially influencing these bark beetle populations. So this is again the timeline for mountain pine beetle in Colorado and spruce beetle in Colorado, and this is just opinionate. I didn't have it just for Colorado, but on Arizona. So as you notice, the opinionates responded right away and then dropped back down. And the opinionates is what's called a multivoltine insect, and so voltinism is basically just the life cycle timing. So the univoltine, it takes 1 year to complete a generation. Semivoltine means it takes 2 years to complete a generation, and multivoltine means it can have multiple generations in a year. So with the opinionates, it's thought that during this drought and really warm climate that it was able to increase the number of generations it had, which resulted in a very fast response. Mountain pine beetle is typically univoltine. It can be semivoltine, take 2 years at high elevations, but predominantly in the lodge bowl up to about 9,000 or 10,000 feet. It can usually get through in a single year. So perhaps its response was a little bit delayed relative to something that can produce multiple generations in a single year. And then spruce beetle is typically semivoltine, so it typically takes 2 years, although as I showed this morning, given the correct, good climate conditions in that summer, it can, at least some part of the population can be univoltine. So maybe it takes even longer to respond to some kind of trigger event like this. So that's just a hypothesis of why we see these changes in response to a particular triggering event like drought. And then I also wanted to make a comment, something that came up as we were discussing earlier. So drought can be a good trigger event, but an ideal condition for a bark beetle population growth would be to have a drought, stress the trees for a couple of years, and then have it be really wet. Because if you have good wet conditions, you're going to have better, not too wet, but you're going to have better tree growth. And actually, much to what people oftentimes think, these insects do way better in trees that are growing fast because they have much more trees, more growth being put on, they're going to have more food. It's just that they can't always get to that resource because a tree that's growing fast is also more defended. But you get a stressed amount and a lot of moisture, so the stress helps the population build up, and then you have this huge, wonderful food resource. That's the best for them. So if you have continued drought on and on and on, you may have that stressor, but you're not going to have a very good food resource to really grow the population. And I guess 2012 in this area is rivaling, the drought is rivaling this 2002 drought as well. And then again, you can't just have the stressor and you can't just have the food, you have to have the appropriate environmental conditions, climate, for that have the direct effect on the insect. So this is just showing what people have probably seen over and over again is the increasing temperatures here. This is all of the U.S. And if you look back, you can see time periods when it was, temperature spike. You know that there was a lot of bark-beetle-caused tree mortality in this time period. And then the 50s outbreak here. So I just want to briefly review what I was talking about this morning, because these are these models that we've developed. And the one for spruce beetle, it's based on this notion that if they get temperature that's appropriate to disrupt this diapause that will occur in the fall, in this life stage, they'll go ahead and become an adult that first winter. And they always have to go through this adult life stage, has to have cold. It's a reproductive diapause. So if they don't get cold as an adult, they won't reproduce. So they're set, but they don't need it. They don't have to have this diapause. So if they get that temperature, which is what we've determined in the field is a certain number of hours greater than 17 degrees after the peak flight, then they won't go into that diapause, and at least some proportion of them will go through in 1 year. So we have a mechanistic model that is driven by hourly temperature to predict that. And then the other one I wanted to show today is for mountain pine beetle, and it's this notion of how cold temperatures influence mortality. And again, it's not just one temperature, it's this whole acclimation process throughout their whole life cycle that allows them to be able to build up the right chemicals to be able to withstand the cold. And we have a model that predicts that as well. Also driven by daily temperatures. So what I've done, and I just did this last weekend, so I haven't really looked at the results. It'll be interesting to see what you guys say. So I'm using this software called Biosim, which was developed by the Canadian Forest Service, Jacques Rainier, and it takes, I'm using the NCDC co-op, widely available on the web, stations across, I just did Colorado, so it's daily temperature data, and I simulated for 1,000 points across the state, each one of the models. So this is, and I did it for the time period over which mortality has been observed. So look at this first panel here. I don't know if you can see it back there. So this is Durango, Grand Junction, and Denver. Kind of give you a reference point. And so the output from the model is masked by the pine layer type that's widely available, described by Little. You can get it off the USGS website. So this is some indication of where pines grow. And the year, so for example, 1999 would have been the year of attack. So in this case, this is looking at how basically winter temperatures are influencing mountain pine beetles. And that 1999 would be attacked in August of 1999, so that would be that winter of 1999 and 2000. So this would be the winter of 2012 into 2013. So, like I said, I just did these last weekend, and I've been kind of staring at them, and a couple of things sort of, and I don't work in Colorado, so I don't know, I'm hoping that you guys can look at it and go, oh yeah, that's where I work. So the red would be a high probability of survival, the highest probability, but even green is 50%, and that's still pretty high for this insect. So a couple of things that stand out this year, 2010, was a really cold one. And I know that from some other work I've been doing in the other parts of the West. And another thing that I was noticing is if you kind of your eyes follow that point, which I guess is the Pike San Isabel, where initially the first part, it was a pretty low probability of survival for mountain pine beetle, and then as we got here later into the 2000s, it gets higher and higher probability. And I don't know if that coincides with you're starting to see more mountain pine beetle influence now relative to previous. Oh, there's some. And this is the Ponderosa Pine Zone, right, that's now being influenced. And it's like a lot of places where it's low elevation or it's not necessarily as warm as you think because of the drafts and stuff. So it's not always really warm.
Yeah, no, I'm surprised at the variability year to year. And certainly in 2010, 2011, a couple polls announced that wondering if hit the Beetles in the right stage.
Well, and I think it again highlights, you know, what has been talked about is the variability across the state in you know, temperature as well as the variability among years. And so it's not like every single year is great. There's good years and bad years, but the cumulative effect of it is that it's been good for the insect. So this again is this was the warmest winter and then the cold. And I don't know if this means anything, but we are seeing this downward. Who knows if it had anything to do with that really cold 2010? It's observational. I'm not saying I have any correlative information. And then this is for spruce beetle. So this is predicting the proportion of the population that would be able to go through in 1 year. And again, if you have 1 year, if you come out in 1 year as opposed to 2, let's say even 50% of them, that's a pretty big increase in the population growth rate. And 50% is again the green, so it doesn't have to be red for it to be good for the insect. So it's not as many striking patterns in this. Again, a lot of so this is the area here where there's been quite a bit of activity, is that correct? So there are definitely, I think I have the next. So again, that early 1999 was a really warm year with pretty good increase. A lot of yellow and green. It's just the highest elevation and still a fairly low proportion. And 2011 rivaled it. So the temperatures recently have been good for spruce beetle and not necessarily as good for mountain pine beetle. And then this was the oldest year based on the model simulation. So is anything like jumping out at anybody at any of these in terms of where you work and what you've seen and what you would have expected? Yeah, Scott.
Well, I guess my observation was that 1999 was preceding year to summer of 2000. We keep talking about 2002, but 2000 was a dry year, a big fire year. And the reason 2002 was so bad is because we had from the fall of 1999 all the way up to 2002 the quite dry seasons building up to it.
And warm.
And I think that the beetle, at least the spruce beetle, started picking up around 2000. We just haven't really seen it.
Yeah. I mean, this would suggest that there was more area favorable for a univoltine population in those 2 years. Although this one is rivaling that, 2011.
Question would be, how is the peak flight time determined? Is that modeled?
It's modeled as well from field data. Yeah, based on temperature.
So if you look at the graph at the bottom there, doesn't that make you think that there's a semi-volatile type process going there with the highs and lows and different flights there? See how you have a...
Well, it's hard to kind of peg it out that way because you can have some beetles coming out univoltine. If I had 5 hands, I could sit here and do it. So you can have some proportion of the population coming univoltine, and some of that same cohort is going to come out the next year. But you can have all these overlapping ones from the previous year. So it's not like they're all either univoltine or they're all either semi-voltine. There's a whole mixture.
Well, I mean, just looking at the variation there, because that's what we were looking at, thinking, okay, we're expecting a bigger flight year this year than the previous year. Well, eventually I think it just had a population level.
Right. So it's good and bad years, and you have ups and downs, and it's a matter of momentum building. And so what we can also do with these models is use climate projections to look at how things might change in the future. And this is merely one climate model and one emission scenario. Ideally, we have this ensemble technique where we take many climate models and many emission scenarios and average it out. But we're in the process of doing that, but right now we have one. And this is, was published in 2009, a bioscience paper. And I just reran it just for Colorado, but it's the exact same information. So this is Spruce Beetle, and I put this warm year that we saw here just as a relative. And so these are climate models, so it's based on 30-year normal data, and then it's probable if you go some stochasm is added into it. So this would have been sort of pre-warming, if you want to think about it that way, which is, not helpful. I mean, this has definitely got a lot more red on it than the pre-warming. And then this would be sort of the current normal. The next time period. And basically, the climate projections are that it's increasing temperature, and so the model is going to say that it's increasing probability of univoltinism as well, all except at these really high elevations. So for mountain pine beetle, I mentioned earlier that it's not just it's not just winter and it's not just summer that are important. It's kind of the combination of the two. So the phenology, where each of the life stages has its own relationship with temperature in terms of how fast or slow they develop. And that will help keep them synced in so that either those eggs or the pupae are not there during winter. And ideally, we would put both the phenology and the cold tolerance information together. And it's been a little bit more difficult than we anticipated, but we do have now a model that that does put both of them together. And we ran it using again, the climate normal. So this is mountain pine beetle, both phenology and cold temperature. And the difference between these panels is this is the sort of, if you think about it, this would be how the climate is favorable for the insect, and this is if you also get that trigger. So you can see, and the scale here is the green is the lowest, and the red goes into red as being the highest. So basically, we only went out to 2030, but suggesting that there's definitely, it's again variable across the West and going into Canada. This is the area here where there's been a range expansion moving into jack pine in Alberta, and our models suggest that it's not like it's going to just go gangbusters forever. Just like sort of in this area here, this is the Yellowstone area. It's still not going to be all that favorable there. It's the high elevation area. Certain areas within Colorado as well. So this is like our first attempt to really sort of be able to look at how climate might be influencing. Yeah.
Can you talk about sort of the trigger versus the what are you using?
Basically, we allowed the population to be successful enough to lay eggs and maybe go through one generation, and then we killed them off. And here we didn't kill them off. So it's more just like what conditions would allow them to actually get started. So a lot of caveats about this. It's merely how our understanding of how temperature influences the insects. There's no trees anywhere in here, which is something that we're in the process of working on right now, because we all know that tree density influences the population success and whether the trees are stressed or not by some kind of climate. So we're in the process of trying to put beetle climate information in with tree density and tree information. This doesn't include any of the community associates, one of the big ones being that we talked about earlier, the fungi that the insect, this is mountain pine beetle, has this very tight relationship with two species of fungi. This is just, the fungi are actually, for mountain pine beetle, not for spruce beetle, it seems to be a less co-evolved system. For mountain pine beetle, the insect has these structures on their mouth parts called mecangium. This little pit right here, this is the mouth part. And that's where the spores of these two fungi are kept. Only these two fungi, nothing else ever gets in there. So it's a really highly co-evolved system, which we haven't found. They carry spores on the outside of the body, but we haven't found a specialized structure. But so the larvae feed on these hyphae, and they get nutrients that they have to have, and then the adults feed on the spores before they emerge. So it's a really tightly co-evolved system, and we're looking at how climate may influence this as well. So these are the two species. One is Grossmannia clavidra, GC, and one is Ophiostoma montium, OM. So the red one here is the GC, yeah. So the GC is the blue, and what we found and what has been in previous information is that the Grossmannia, which is believed to be the one that confers the most benefit to the insect nutritionally, grows better at cooler temperatures, and the Ophiostoma grows better at warmer temperatures. So it could be with warming temperatures that they lose this good associate that they have. And so we're developing a model where we can couple it with our mountain pine beetle model and look at what will happen if they lose this one associate. So models don't include any of that stuff either. And perhaps more importantly, well not more importantly, but also they don't include any kind of adaptation of the insect to climate. And we've done a lot of work with mountain pine beetles showing that across its range, it's very, very different genetically in terms of how it responds to temperature. So a population in Southern California or in Arizona, for example, has different thresholds and rates of development given a certain temperature than one in central Idaho. So there's been enough local adaptation that it has occurred to get these divergent adaptations, and which suggests, and we're looking at this as well genetically, how fast could they adapt to these increasing temperatures. So that's another line of research that we're doing. So I think that's my last slide. Yeah. So if there's any questions?
You speculated all about the Western pine beetle.
Western pine beetle is another one that is multi-bolting, so it has multiple generations in a year. And there isn't much information at all known about its relationship to temperature. Unfortunately, we've been trying to get funding to do that. But one thing I know, so Western really only gets into ponderosa pine, Coulter pine as well in California. And so anywhere where Western pine beetle and mountain pine beetle distributions overlap, and there's ponderosa pine, you usually don't find mountain pine beetle doing all that much because mountain pine beetle takes so much longer to develop, and Western pine beetle get out-competed. So like up on the Front Range, where mountain pine beetle is getting into ponderosa pine, they have that kind of out of range of Western. But I'm sorry, I don't have any information. I wish I did. Yeah.
So you mentioned that the insects, as they're going into this winterization phase, that they can be very susceptible to a cold snap during that period, like in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
Is that also the same for the spring when temperatures are warming up? Like
yeah, so they metabolize it in the fall, and then it's the opposite process of metabolism in the spring where they're using it. And so if they get to a point where they've lost more than the temperature gives them, then yeah, they could.
Because I get that question a lot. I mean, the general news is always, we need a cold snap in the winter, 40 degrees below zero for 2 weeks to kill off the beetles. But I've always felt like maybe those extreme temperatures in the fall and the spring might have more of an impact on the pollinators.
That's what we think, because in the middle of winter, they're ready for it. It's just in the other time periods that they're not. So in this model, we don't have a model for spruce beetle, unfortunately. There's some data, but not enough to parameterize the model. But you can run this model on a daily basis too, and so you can look. I have some outputs where you can look and see. Oh yeah, there it was. It was that temperature that got them in October. All right. Well, thanks everyone.